One of the things that I find really annoying about my mom is how she seems to live her life based on a bunch of little platitudes. I asked her about it once, and she said that it's something that she learned from her parents, and I presume that her parents learned it from their parents before them. I don't know. But now that I'm getting older, I find myself, I guess, defaulting to these neat little one-liners that I kind of turn to when I need some sort of guidance on how to live my life. Things like, don't be an asshole, shut up and listen to your wife, and for the purposes of this video, when in doubt, Debian. 30 years ago, Ian Murdoch founded Debian, and I'm pretty sure that a complete history of the project isn't too difficult to find online. I remember seeing a PDF about it somewhere. So instead of talking about the development of the Debian project and how it spawned some of the most popular Linux distributions and all of that sort of thing, I figured I'd just talk about my experience with the distro and how it ended up as one of my life one-liners, I guess we're going to call them. So flashback to around 2011, I was working my first job. I was in sales, and my rickety old laptop, this compact Presario V3500 from the college years, was running Windows Vista. And it was slow, really slow. It'd take anywhere between 5 to 10 minutes just to boot up. And for some inexplicable reason, it would shut itself down after about 15 to 20 minutes of light use. So I wasn't sure if it was a virus or something, but either way, the thing was literally unusable. I could have probably just done a nuke and pave or upgrade to Windows 7 or something to that effect, but doing all of that all those years ago was nowhere near as easy or cheap as it is now, at least on the Windows front. Alternatively, I could have gotten myself a new laptop. But like I said, this was my first job, so I really wasn't making all that much, and I didn't want to get into any sort of debt. So I was left with what I eventually found out was perfectly good hardware without a working operating system. A friend of mine from college had tinkered with this thing called Ubuntu the year before, and he told me about it. An operating system, he said, that was completely free and you could easily install it on old hardware. And so I installed it on my laptop one night, and just like that, my outlook on computers and technology just fundamentally changed. I'm the type of person that feels the need to go down these research rabbit holes whenever I find something interesting or whenever I get into something. So just as an example, around 2007 or 2008, when StarCraft 2 was announced, my little brother and I decided to dig up our old copies of StarCraft Brood War and install it on our computers as a way to prepare for StarCraft 2. StarCraft 1 was immensely popular and formative for us in the 90s and early 2000s, and instead of just playing the game, I ended up falling down the rabbit hole of Liquipedia and the Korean pro scene. I watched all of the MSLs and OSLs and Pro Leagues. I ended up listening to the casts of Klazart, Diggity, Moletrap, Nuke the Stars, and of course Tastosis. I studied the openings of mostly Zerg varieties. I played Zerg. So I could tell you the difference between a 4-pool, a 9-pool, an overpool, a 12-pool, 3-hatch before pool, all of that sort of thing. And just to be clear, I wasn't particularly good at doing all of these things. I mean, I was better than somebody that would just play casually, but I was never going to do any of that cool Muta Micro stuff like Jaedong or Jelizerg. But the point is, I really got into it. And yeah, I still watch the Afrika Star League every now and then, but I really got into it. And it was sort of the same thing with Linux. So back to that. I was running Ubuntu 11.10, and I was doing my research into this new to me Linux thing. And of course, one of the things that you learn about the Ubuntu distribution when you do a little bit of reading is that it's based on this thing called Debian. So I told myself, I really like this Ubuntu thing, so maybe I'm going to like the Debian thing that this Ubuntu thing is based on. So I tried it out, and I was wrong. With wide-eyed optimism, I installed Debian 6 and was faced with a bunch of questions like, what do you mean there's no Firefox? What do you mean Wi-Fi doesn't work out of the box? Like, what do you mean I have to use old software when, the newer stuff is out for other distributions? So after that initial little rendezvous with Debian, I continued distro hopping, and like the good little distro hopper I had become at that point, I hopped and hopped around and eventually hopped on Arch, where I still kind of live today. But all this time, like at the back of my mind, I knew that there was a place for Debian in this GNU Linux landscape. Like on more than one occasion in the past 10 years, I broke my Arch install. And every time that happened, I would think to myself, like, this wouldn't have been a problem if I were on Debian, right? And initially, whenever I had to spin up something like a file server or a torrent server or something, I would use Ubuntu. But eventually, I found myself sort of gravitating towards Debian, knowing that nothing was going to break it because of those older versions of software rigorously tested by people much more experienced than me. Yeah, I mean, the Wi-Fi thing sucked, but that was just really a matter of downloading another ISO. And if I'm being honest, the Debian Free Software Guidelines document is one of those pillars of the entire GNU/Linux ecosystem. So, like, that's a pretty big thing. And just as on the side, I absolutely love the Toy Story series. And Debian's naming convention being names of Toy Story characters is just completely awesome. Right? It's, in my mind, almost as awesome as that time that Fedora named its distribution Beefy Miracle. Like, yeah, I thought the Beefy Miracle thing was awesome. Anyway, so a couple of years in, I kind of liked Debian, and it was being used here and there for like the home lab type stuff, and I had become quite comfortable doing that sort of thing in the Debian-derived world, or, on Debian itself. But then something happened in 2019 that elevated Debian from simply this reliable distro that I occasionally use as the operating system on a file server to one-liner that I kind of base my tech life around. If you're familiar with what was going on at this time, you might know where this is going. Debian. It runs on basically anything. Like, as I alluded to earlier, my little file server next to the router runs Debian. The ISS runs Debian. That little netbook next to me that's connected to the printer, yeah, that runs Debian. So, in the late 2010s, what I'm saying is that distros started dropping 32-bit support, which really shouldn't have been too much of a problem, except if you're like me and inherited an HP Mini with an Atom N280 in it and salvaged an Acer Aspire with a Pentium M in it. Like, you kind of need 32-bit support if you don't want those computers to end up in a landfill. And in that moment, it kind of felt like my initial like Linux origin story, if I'm being completely honest. Right? Arch had long dropped 32-bit support. Ubuntu had just dropped 32-bit support. And it was sort of like hardware without an operating system. And yeah, I guess that's being kind of dramatic. And yeah, there were a bunch of alternatives like OpenSUSE and they still have 32-bit support. But the fact of Debian basically running on anything, and specifically continuing 32-bit support, was just a really big thing for me. Strange as it might sound. Anyway, earlier this year, just a little story, my wife and I were talking about getting a new printer because one of the old Epson L350 printers died on us. She briefly considered getting a Wi-Fi printer, but we ended up getting an Epson L210, which is probably the cheapest printer that Epson offers, or at least it was the cheapest printer at the store we went to. And because of a one-liner that I live my life by, what I ended up doing was getting the old HP Mini I alluded to earlier, putting Debian on it, installed cups, and turned the L210 into a network printer. Like, super basic stuff, I know. It's a really small thing, but being able to print without having the stupid cord sticking out of the side of a laptop is something my wife kind of wanted, and we didn't have to pay anything extra for it, really. Like, we got the cheaper printer instead of buying the more expensive Wi-Fi printers, and I didn't have to get an additional single board computer or whatever to give it wireless functionality. We just went with an old computer. I don't know. The fact that an old netbook with a 32-bit CPU in it didn't end up in a landfill, and spouse approval factor was achieved because of a thing a dude named Ian did 30 years ago is what's pretty cool. So yeah, if you have a piece of technology, it probably runs Debian. I don't know. In the grand scheme of things, somebody babbling on the internet that repurposed an old laptop and put together a home lab or print server or something like that is just minuscule. But over the past decade or so, Debian has become a big part of who I am as a user of technology. So hey, happy birthday, Debian. And here's to many more installs. See you around.